Today, we're going to unpack one of the most dramatic and controversial chapters in the history of Indian democracy, the 1975 emergency. I mean, this was a time that really tested the country's democratic politics, its institutions, everything. So the big question is, how did the world's largest democracy get pushed right to the edge? Well, let's dive in. Okay, so imagine this. You wake up on the morning of June 26, 1975. You grab your newspaper, open it up, and you see this, a completely blank space where the editorial should be. For so many Indians, this was how they found out that something profound had changed, basically overnight. Newspapers like Nai Denya did this as a silent but incredibly powerful protest against the government's sudden crackdown on press freedom. It was a chilling sign that democracy, as they knew it, had just been put on pause.
And this change, it was just so swift and so shocking. On the night of June 25, 1975, the President of India declared a state of internal emergency. And I mean, in the dead of night, the power to major newspaper offices was cut. By the time the sun came up, tons of opposition leaders and political activists had already been arrested. Get this, the Prime Minister's own cabinet was only told about it after it had all gone down.
But a shock like this doesn't just come out of nowhere, right? It was really the explosion of a political pressure cooker that had been building for years. The pressure was coming from 3 different directions, all at once, and it was pushing the entire system to its breaking point. Let's take a look at what was feeding the fire. First, you had a massive economic crisis. The 1971 Bangladesh War had put a huge strain on India's economy. Then, the US government cut off all aid. And on top of that, international oil prices just went through the roof. The result? Insane inflation. I'm talking prices shooting up 23% in 1973, and then an almost unbelievable 30% in 1974. Industrial growth was flat, unemployment was super high, and to top it all off, the government froze the salaries of its own workers. You can just imagine the deep dissatisfaction this created all across the country. So all that economic pain, it didn't take long for it to boil over into political unrest. You had these huge student protests breaking out in states like Gujarat and Bihar over corruption and all the price hikes. And these movements found a real leader in this charismatic figure, Jayaprakash Narayan, or JP as everyone called him. He called for a total revolution, a complete transformation to create what he called a true democracy. All the non-Congress opposition parties rallied behind him, and they started to pitch him as the big alternative to Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. Things got so tense that in 1974, a nationwide railway strike almost paralyzed the entire country. The third source of pressure was this growing showdown between the government and the judiciary. The Supreme Court had made a landmark ruling saying that Parliament couldn't just change the basic features of the Constitution. The government saw this as a huge roadblock. Tensions really peaked in 1973 when the government broke a long-standing tradition and appointed a new Chief Justice, passing over 3 more senior judges who, not coincidentally, had all ruled against the government. This led to this really worrying idea of needing a committed judiciary, basically one that would be loyal to the government's agenda. It was a serious clash between 2 pillars of democracy. So you have these 3 massive pressures: economic, political, and judicial, all building and building. In June 1975, they finally hit their boiling point. And the final trigger was a dramatic court ruling that struck right at the heart of the government, targeting the Prime Minister herself. The last couple of days were an absolute whirlwind. It all kicked off on June 12th, when the Allahabad High Court actually declared Prime Minister Indira Gandhi's election invalid. Just 12 days later, the Supreme Court gave her a partial stay. She could stay on as Prime Minister, but she couldn't vote in Parliament. For the opposition, that wasn't nearly enough. The very next day, June 25th, they held this massive rally in Delhi demanding she resign immediately. The government's answer came that very night. The president declared a state of emergency. The legal tool they used was Article 352 of the Constitution, and they invoked it because of internal disturbance. Now, the amount of power this single article granted was just extraordinary. Once it was declared, the whole federal power-sharing system was basically suspended. All power was now concentrated with the central government. And here's the crucial part. It gave the government the power to suspend or totally restrict the fundamental rights of every citizen. And the change was immediate and just drastic. Before the emergency, you had guaranteed fundamental rights. During, they were suspended. You had a free press. It was replaced with censorship. Protests were allowed. Now they were banned. Opposition leaders were free.
Now they were in jail. And maybe most importantly, the right to go to court to challenge your own arrest, a basic legal protection called habeas corpus, was suspended. The doors to the courts were effectively slammed shut for ordinary people.
This situation went on for 18 long months. Then, in January 1977, the government did something pretty surprising. It called for general elections. And right away, that election became something much bigger. It became a referendum on the emergency itself. So, would the people of India approve of what the government had done, or would they reject it?
Well, the verdict was absolutely decisive. The opposition parties, who had all banded together to form something called the Janata Party, ran on a very simple slogan: Save democracy. And they won. They didn't just win, they won in a landslide, taking a massive 330 seats. The ruling Congress Party, on the other hand, was crushed, down to just 154 seats.
You have to understand, this wasn't just another election loss. This was a political earthquake. For the very first time since India became independent back in 1947, the Congress Party, which had ruled nonstop for 30 years, was voted out of power. The emergency and the way it ended left this incredibly deep mark on India. The country learned some really valuable and pretty painful lessons about its own democracy, and those lessons have become really core principles for keeping it healthy ever since. So what were these lessons? Well, first, resilience. The whole experience proved that even with its weaknesses, it's actually incredibly difficult to completely get rid of democracy in India. The second big lesson was about constitutional safeguards. That vague term, internal disturbance, was replaced with a much higher bar of armed rebellion to declare an emergency, and it became mandatory for the president to get written advice from the cabinet first. And third, it sparked this whole new appreciation for civil liberties. It led to a much more active and watchful judiciary, dedicated to protecting those individual freedoms, a legacy that really continues to shape the country today.
But the emergency also left us with some really tough questions that we're still wrestling with. And it kind of leaves us with this fundamental question that came out of that time, but honestly is just as relevant today for any democracy. What is the right balance between the normal day-to-day running of a government and the right of its citizens to be in a state of continuous political protest? It's a tension that's right at the heart of democracy and something that every generation really has to figure out for itself.